Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why body part splits or bro splits tends to give slower muscle growth in completely drug-free lifters. Now, when I state this, this is based on what we know about muscle growth, tons of studies about volume, frequency, everything else done over the decades, and we have to remember we're talking about, in some cases, relatively small differences. So when I say less gains, that doesn't mean no gains, right? It doesn't mean no gains. And I want people to understand that distinction. And I think people need to remember that frequently, a lot of times, guys, if they train long enough, will gain a pretty good chunk of their natural size, even with something that gives them slower results, as long as they train hard and consistent. In other words, if your technique, workloads, training ethic are really, really high, you'll still probably gain more muscle on a body part split than you will on something more effective if you train like a pussy. Okay, we need to make that distinction here. And what we need to remember is that when we're talking about for purely hypertrophy purposes, when we're not dealing with any form of periodization, when anabolic doses get high enough, you probably are not going to see in enhanced lifters any significant difference in muscle growth based on training frequency, right? Usually, generally, just your total weekly volume is probably all that matters to a certain extent. Now, again, you'll still note that most of the best strength athletes in the world still train each muscle group multiple times a week, with some exceptions. There are some who literally have a squat day, a bench day, a deadlift day, and they train insane amounts of volume. They do exist, and we can't deny that fact. So, over to the point. People would say, well, why? Well, a lot of it has to do with muscle growth time and recovery from training volume. All right, and there's a balancing act between these two, because what we find is that when we get into a single training session, when higher volumes of training are done, and when I say higher volumes of training, we're talking about effective training where sets are taken to failure. Right? When sets are taken to failure, so that we know there was no reps in reserve. Okay? And failure means exactly what it sounds like. It doesn't mean till you can't go anymore in forced reps or any of that nonsense. Failure means momentary muscle failure. Very rarely in studies do we see additional muscle growth from about 10 sets in a session for a given muscle. Okay? Rarely. And what we oftentimes see, if it's high fatigue exercises like a squat, right? A back squat done as an example. Some of the really big exercises that are very fatiguing, we start finding that muscle growth in those studies is reduced when we exceed 10 sets. So 15 set groups tend to gain slightly less muscle than the 10 set group. The 20 set group gains slightly less. And I want people to note that when we come over and say they gain less, again, it doesn't mean zero. Okay? Less and zero are not the same thing. And what we have to look at is what muscles are being worked as the primary movers. In other words, when we look at a lot of these sets, most experts and coaches, they consider the bench press to be a full set for the front delts and the pecs, but a half set for the triceps. Because the triceps get a little less stimulation. Just using that as an example, so that we can differentiate and say, oh, so you're saying rows would exceed this for biceps? Well, probably not. Rows would probably count as a half set for the biceps. Lat pull downs would be a half set for the biceps. The bicep is heavily involved, but it doesn't take the brunt of the load, and it's not going to get full activation relative to the lats. Okay. So when you look at this data, we start finding that unless you have good reasons to, or you're being very, very careful with your training modalities, or you're doing certain things with your training modalities, like in my case, I might do 10 sets for my pecs after a max bench. We're not really hitting true 15 sets there, right? That max bench maybe counts as one set in terms of effective stimulus. Okay, so it really would be something like 11 sets. And then I'll do 5 or 6 extra sets for triceps, because the triceps only got half sets. Okay, we've had studies where they've looked at direct tricep work done, and no muscle growth was ever seen going beyond 14 sets. In a couple different studies that look specifically at that, using that as an example, in an entire, a week. So we know that there's a cap in terms of intra-session training volume that can stimulate muscle growth. People would say, why? That doesn't make sense. Doesn't more stimulus equal more growth? Yes, more stimulus equals more growth potential. The downside, you have to recover from it. During a certain chunk of the recovery window, you are not growing. So if it takes another 4 hours, say you've initiated so much tissue damage or so much general fatigue that it takes you an extra 4 or 5 hours to recover from the training session because you did 15 sets of squats instead of 10, what do you think happens? You get less growth. Even though you did more work and you stimulated more, the fatigue was so high that the recovery window extended so far that you gain less muscle out of it. So we know that there's largely a cap on that. Well, the same thing, we can come over and we can look at frequency. Most studies on frequency, some exceptions, show that the majority of people on structured programs tend to gain the most muscle. They tend to gain the most muscle if we do a frequency of about twice a week. Now, there can be some exceptions. Like I'll break the back up to some extent. And a lot of my guys, we might train our lats 4 days a week and back and everything. But even most of my clients, we do too. Again, if you go beyond 2, the volume has to go down though. Right? Volume has to go down. So if you want to train a muscle group beyond 2 times a week, you can't do the, well, let's see, if 10 sets is ideal, I could just train each muscle 4 days a week with 10 sets. Well, that sounds good in theory, but you'll end up with so much training volume that you'll never fully recover. You won't recover enough to hit your growth window. So what's our growth window look like? Up to 48 hours. Okay, it's up to 48 hours. Well, here's where it gets nuanced. We only see 48-hour growth windows when we're approaching maximum recoverable volume. Now, that's for the myofibular component. There was one study, a single study done, and no, I don't have it handy. I don't even know if I could find it again, where women, a group of women, found that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, not the myofibular, the contractile proteins, but the sarcoplasm in the muscle cells did continue to grow for 72 hours after their training on really high volume workouts. But barring that one odd study, the general rule seems to be up to about 48 hours. Now, the 48 hours isn't guaranteed. It can be reduced depending upon training volumes. Okay? It will be reduced depending on training volumes. So you guys see where we're going with this, right? If you have a recovery window where if the volume goes too high, we start cutting into the growth window, and a muscle is not going to grow beyond 48 hours, there's going to be a balancing act between how much volume you can handle in a session and how much muscle you'll gain. So if you're only training a muscle once a week, you're not getting anywhere near the amount of growth time that you really need to make it grow. Now, anabolic substances can extend that window considerably. They also speed up the recovery time. So if someone is using copious amounts of some of these substances, of course, in a dose-dependent response, meaning you can't say natural versus enhanced. And I hate it when people do that. It's a dose-dependent response. Not everyone who's enhanced has on the same amount of stuff. There are literally people who take 50 to the 100 times as much as some other people. And that's not an exaggeration. All right, look at the autopsy of Dallas McCarver and his blood work. And you need to comprehend how much stuff had to be in his system for his blood work to look like that on his autopsy. This is a guy who was using easily 20 times the amount of testosterone that an average cycle is. Not double, 20 times. The difference between taking 1 shot of Jack Daniels and 20 shots of Jack Daniels at once. Big difference. Okay, so when you look at these things from the perspective of a clean lifter, you're not going to get maximum muscle growth off of 1 workout a week. Okay, you're just not. And we know that weekly volume affects muscle growth. We know that weekly volume affects muscle growth. But even when we spread it out over multiple sessions, when we start exceeding about 20 sets a week, unless massive lifestyle factors are there or special recovery supplements are there, we generally don't see, other than in a very rare study, and it contradicts the majority of studies we have, we don't usually see any extra muscle growth from that. Okay? And in some cases, we get nearly maximum growth from as few as 5 sets. In some studies, we've seen some muscles grow from 5 sets to failure, and that's the most muscle they gain from any other comparison. They don't always gain more even from 10. It depends on the muscle and the person and their recovery. So realistically, if we know our cap is 20, as far as real work sets for a muscle, and some exercises will be half sets for some muscles, your maximum growth windows are probably going to occur when we start doing things in the range of maybe up to 10 sets twice a week. Or, with certain muscles, we could do lats or whatever, 5 sets 4 times a week. So ultimately, what does this mean? That there's no real benefit to doing serious main training more than about 4 days a week. And barring some muscle groups, it seems to be closer to ideal to do everything twice a week. There's wiggle room on that. But that seems to be what the data tends to indicate. So when people say, so why would people gain less muscle on a body part split? Well, because you're just not stimulating enough muscle growth. Or you're doing so much volume in a training session trying to stimulate more growth that you gain less from it. And you only have one workout for a muscle to grow off of each week. And at least with some of the upper body lifts, there'll be some overlap. But if you're training legs only once a week, best of luck to you. You're going to have small chicken legs probably the rest of your training days in a weak squat. There are exceptions, but that's the likely scenario. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.